Hey, we've come outside to practice with the AV mode, or A, which is the one prioritizing the aperture, so that we can see the difference between working with a room light and exterior light. We're going to take a picture focusing on the depth of field and blur. That's why we need to use an open aperture and a telephoto lens. Those who have it, obviously. Why? Because an angle lens isn't as effective for getting a blur effect as longer focal length. As we want to achieve a blur effect, and that's why we are working with the AV mode, we are also going to choose the longest focal length lens possible, like of 55 millimeters, 70 millimeters, 105 millimeters, depending on your camera, okay? What we are going to do is, I'm going to take a close-up of this flower, trying to get a quite blurry background. So we need an open aperture. When I rotated the dial, the aperture and the shutter speed change accordingly. Let's prioritize the aperture and choose a wide open aperture with a 55 millimeter lens, which is 5.6. So when I press the shutter release, the camera adjusts the speed automatically, which can be at 1/20, 1/30, 1/15. What happens when we take a picture with a speed of 1/20 or 15? These are slow speeds below the movement limit, so we need to either blow ISO up or select an automatic ISO, which some cameras offer. Okay, so let's try it. So now what? When we select the auto ISO, the camera adjusts it at a high sensitivity, around 400, 200 or 800, depending on the lights, in order to work with a not really slow speed and avoid getting a blurred image. So explore your camera's feature to check if this ISO option is included or not. Well, now we'll be able to work in an easier and faster way than with the manual mode. Why? Because if we were working in manual mode, then we need to adjust the ISO unless the auto is included in your camera, the aperture as well, and the speed. So we'd also need to pay attention to the light variation and so on. The AV mode is way much easier since only by adjusting the aperture and selecting the auto ISO, the speed on the ISO will be adjusted automatically, and thus will save a lot of time. It's extremely useful, especially in those cases we are in a hurry. If you got plenty of time, you can use this manual mode. Although, as I said, these manual modes aren't that as useful as automatic modes, okay? Let's move on now to the exposure mode TV, which prioritizes the shutter speed or exposure time. Some cameras refer to this with an S. This time we are going to do a panning exercise in a simpler and faster way than with the manual mode. If you remember, with the manual mode, the exposure meter is constantly moving toward the plus or minus signs, depending on the amount of light going through the camera. With this mode, the TV mode, we'll set a specific speed and the aperture will be adjusted automatically based on the amount of light of the scene. As we're going to do a panning, we need that the speed is below the limit, which is around 1/125 or divided 60. I'm going to set the speed at 1/50, for example. When I orientate the camera to the object I want to shoot, we'll see that the aperture varies according to the amount of light of the scene. Okay, so it depends on the light. And again, this is one of the advantages of working with these semi-automatic modes. We only need to adjust one parameter and the camera does the rest. Guys, pay attention to the following, as we are going to work with a slow speed. In the case the speed were too slow for the scene lights, the camera would let us know. In this case, when I set it at 1/50, the camera adjusts correctly the aperture. There's no problem. However, if I choose a slower speed, like 3 seconds, this number over here, which is the aperture, starts blinking. Can you see it? It means that the semi-automatic modes are of great help, but we need to be careful and pay attention to the scene lights in order to check if the parameter I set works fine for the scene. What is this blinking telling us? That the speed we are using at the moment is too slow and there's plenty of light. So we'd need a smaller aperture in order to get an acceptable result. To solve this, first we need to bear in mind that if ISO is at 100, we can't change it, unless our camera allows us to change it. As we can't close the aperture neither, so we'll have to reduce the speed until the blinking disappears. In this case, it is stopped at 1/3 of a second, so I cannot use a speed under this limit. We are going to do now a panning. So, such a slow speed isn't necessary, okay? Thus, as I was saying, I'm going to set it at 1/50, which will be enough for the exercise. Let's practice the panning in TV mode so that you can see how easy and fast it is to work with this mode. Why? Well, light is adjusted gradually depending on the orientation of the lens. Okay, in the last part of this lesson on exposure modes, we are going to give the P mode a try. This is the program mode. This mode is similar to the AV or TV modes because all of them depend on the reciprocity rule. If you remember, it is when a parameter is adjusted automatically after setting another one, based on the light of the scene. So in the P mode, which can be used for general scenes such as photos of the street or of someone else, it is those cases when we aren't particularly interested in reflecting blur or movement. So as I said, this mode is quite similar to the automatic mode, but allows us to control some parameters. I'm also going to tell you how to calibrate the exposure when working with semi-automatic modes, AV, TV, and P. As a general rule, the exposure is at 0. Remember that the difference between the auto and the semi-automatic mode is that in the first one, it's constantly moving, while in the semi-automatic modes, it's set at 0. What are we going to do? First, I'm going to take a picture with exposure at 0, and after that, I'm going to check if it would be better to add light or reduce the amount of light. As I said before, it will depend on your camera. In this one, I can modify it by pressing AV +- button and then rotating the dial. I can move the meter to +1 or -1 or +2 or -2. In addition, another advantage is that this value is maintained while taking the picture. It doesn't change. Let's say that we find a picture too dark. We can solve it easily by adding more light with the exposure method. Now we're going to take a photo here, a low-angle shot of these palm trees, because there's a contrast between the shadows and the blue sky. This way we'll see if, after taking the picture, it's better to overexpose or underexpose. Remember that with the AV mode, we set the aperture, and with the TV mode, we set the shutter speed. We've been talking about it before, okay? The P mode, on the contrary, sets both aperture and speed, and you can control them. It's like none of them is prioritized, okay? Although the three of them work under the reciprocity rule. Well, once the practice is over, we can say that we've seen all the main features regarding the semi-automatic exposure modes. The warnings, the problems we may face, how to compensate the exposure, as well as the auto ISO features, which is really useful for saving time instead of using the manual mode. The important thing here, however, is to understand and be aware of the amount of light of the scene and the relationship between the ISO sensitivity, shutter speed, aperture, and my purpose. It is where I want to shoot and how I want to do it. Blur, get motion, and so on. Well, guys, hope you give it a try and see you in the next lesson.